Hello, we are back and we are looking at video number 14. Can't believe it that we're getting along in our series here called Seriously, and it's based, or we're looking at the Sermon on the Mount based on the book by Skye Jethani, What If Jesus Was Serious? Looking at chapters 60 and 61 today. And this is based on the teaching that Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount, where he's talking about judging a person's character by their actions, and he uses a metaphor about trees and fruit. And what he's actually saying is that it's your character that actually produces good fruit, and that a tree produces fruit based on its identity. And as followers of Jesus, our identity is supposed to be as citizens of the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah, and so we touched on a little bit in this last video.
Yeah,
and the idea that we want to learn how to obey Jesus' teaching. It starts with the idea of loving
him first. Yeah,
and the actions come later, and they become a byproduct of that relationship, which is us loving him. It's really important, and him loving us back.
That's right. Yeah, and I think sometimes we get that backwards. We try and either please God by behaving correctly,
right,
or we believe that there's a list of rules to follow in order for us to be citizens of the kingdom of heaven. And what God and Jesus is actually looking for is a relationship.
That's right.
So in John 15, where Jesus talks about the parable of the grapevine, he says that the branches or he encourages people to abide in him like branches are grafted or are part of a vine. So that's the idea I want to explore a little bit today, as well as a temptation that comes along with that for Jesus followers. So this idea of abiding with or loving Jesus or connecting with Jesus, how is it that we do it?
Well, I think we look at it a few different ways, but one, we want to do it, I would say we want to do is daily.
Yeah.
And so we want to pray.
Yeah.
And let's not get caught up on, like how long.
Yeah.
Well, we want to pray,
or how often.
Yeah, it's just like try to take some time. Simplicity is great.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing to do is we want to read the Bible, but also reflect on what we're reading, especially a particular thing about Jesus or what Jesus is teaching. And to really discover, okay, what is it he's saying, and what does that mean for me and to me as well as to us. And how do I and we want to live that out in our life?
Yeah, and I think this is an important thing. I was reading this week about the idea of how to do this. And lots of times we as preachers, when we preach a sermon, we give context and what people were thinking back then, and we try and understand. So when Jesus says, "My peace I give to you," we analyze it up, way down and center and backwards and forwards, and we come up with a solution where I think the idea that is being presented here is that we just kind of accept that Jesus wants us to have peace and expect him to provide it for us.
That's right.
So it's not trying to necessarily come to a place where we understand everything about it. We just take Jesus at his word that he wants us to have peace.
Yeah. And so, I think it is really important then to make sure that whenever we're reflecting that we are thinking, how is this living out in my life?
Yeah, exactly.
In the everyday, boring, mundane parts of it, and that's just it. Pausing to include Jesus in our day.
Yeah, this is a good one too. I like this. There's a little book by it was a 16th century monk called Brother Lawrence, and he had this idea that he was having a hard time following the monks' usual rituals of prayer and the time they spent and how often they did. So he just decided to talk to Jesus while he was doing his everyday tasks, while he was washing the dishes or scrubbing the floors, and he kind of tried to include Jesus in his day. And I've tried this before, and it's not as easy as it sounds. I get distracted or you get caught up in what you're doing sometimes. But sometimes it just helps to just stop and take a minute and say, okay, kind of like you're catching up with a friend or whatever, right? Or sending a text to somebody. those kinds of things. Think about that as a way to connect with Jesus during your day.
That's right. And just risk looking foolish when people look at you in the car and you're talking to Jesus.
Yeah.
Lively conversations.
No, I think it's not just the car anymore. I see more people with head or earbuds in, and they've obviously that's wirelessly now. It can be connected to their phones or not. You don't know whether they're talking to somebody or talking to you or talking to themselves. So, I don't think we have to risk anything these days
That's true.
by doing that. So one little tool that I found helpful, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes, is John Eldredge. He's written many books that have been helpful to people over the years. He's a psychologist who's actually a Christian, and he wrote a book called Resilient, and he created a sort of little app to help us do that. It's actually called Pause, so it's available in the whatever store your device is attached to, and it just puts a little reminder up to pause during your day. And then he has sort of just there's I think a 1 minute, a 3 minute, a 5 minute pause, and basically he just kind of walks you through just his voice gives you a guided voice tour of, just take a minute. What do you need to give to Jesus? Ask Jesus to help you with your day and to just restore our unity with him. And they're just 3 little simple things like that. But I found it, I've been trying to practice this, and I'm getting really good at doing it at least once a day now. And I'm up to a couple times on different days. But just the idea that taking that pause during the day does somehow help me connect with Jesus more than just my scheduled prayer times or things like that. So I think it is important to try and maintain that connection, because obviously we all live a real life, and we all have problems, and we all go through things, and sometimes they're good things, and sometimes there's bad things, and sometimes they're just good old boring things. But Jesus cares about all of that with us. So
yeah, I think we got to just note that there is the temptation that we all have, and I think we just acknowledging this is important. I know sometimes it's quick to say, "Oh, I don't have that temptation." I think we all have this temptation, whether it's based on some social pressures, whether it's based on just sort of like idealized sort of what it needs to look like, and it's to appear godly, whether we are or are not. Yeah, and basically the idea is we are looking to impress. Sometimes it's other people. Sometimes it's even ourselves.
Yeah, and I think this is really important, particularly with other followers of Jesus, because someone who maybe share the same values as us, and could be your family, could be your spouse, could be your church community, could be your friends. But yeah, I think we all face that. We know, or we have this idea of how we should act, and we don't always act that way, but we always give the appearance that we got it all together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so then we're not really focusing on soil, roots, vine, trees. We're connecting with Jesus, loving him and being loved by him. We kind of start to focus on displaying the right
behaviors,
impressive behaviors in front of people, and as opposed to the real
just being real when you go
things that are going on.
And I love what in the book Skye Jethani calls this being a Christmas tree Christian.
Yeah, this was good.
Where we have these beautifully decorated, he calls it fake fruit, that draws attention to ourselves the way a natural tree just doesn't. And really what a Christmas tree is, if we face the facts about it, I guess, is it's really, they're just corpses. They're cut off from the soil, and roots are being barely kept alive in a pot of water that needs to be filled constantly, only delaying the inevitable dropping of the needles.
That's right. And then just this whole metaphor, Skye is talking about people who confess, what everyone say, follow Jesus, and they may look the part in a lot of ways. The idea that they attend church every Sunday, whatever event, whatever small group, whatever program is being done. Yeah. And people actually could be leaders as well. They're doing all this stuff, but they have really no relationship
with Jesus. Yeah. And that's, well, it's kind of sad, actually, that we have to, or sometimes we feel like we have to put that front up, and it's a lot of work.
It is.
And it really isn't. It isn't necessary. What Jesus really wants is for us to be real and have a relationship with him.
And I think it's really important to taking that moment to reflect on ourselves, like in making sure that we don't find ourselves pulled to that temptation, because we do need to take the very real acknowledgement that it's a good pull, that we can absolutely and probably have many times fell for.
Yep. And particularly as leaders, I mean, you and I both are paid staff at the church here. And I know in my missional community, one time I shared a bit of a struggle I was having. And I one of the people in my group was quite taken aback that, you know, that I would, one, share that struggle. He probably figured I had some, but I guess he just wasn't used to pastors talking about that to other people. And lots of times I would say that we haven't in the past, just because we were afraid to appear like, you know, that we were, I don't even, when I try and think it and even trying to say it out loud, it doesn't even sound right. That's my job to portray that I have it all together when I don't. So, it's just, I don't know, it's almost silly, I guess, that we try and do that, but it's extremely hard work and it can be exhausting. And then I really, when Jesus was talking about this, he used the example of false teachers or false leaders. Yeah. And I think we talked about this last video that we were going to talk about this video. Right. And so how do we actually distinguish between leaders and teachers who are truly godly and those who are just, as Skye put it, Christmas trees?
Well, I think ultimately it's time and proximity.
Yep.
You know, because on the outside, it can look virtually the same.
Yep.
And I think that's something we need to really take that back, take a step back and think that it can look virtually the same.
Especially if we measure by cultural effectiveness, like we talked about in the last video, where we have big crowds and big buildings and costly projects and impact on the community. And again, we're not bashing big churches or churches that have those things. Those are all good things. But what really differentiates, as you said, is proximity and time. That's the real test of how we tell whether a person's character. So let's talk about proximity.
Yeah, well, proximity is the thing that's going to really help us see.
Yeah,
you're going to see the person, whoever it is, that teacher, that prophet, whatever you want to give that name to that person. You're going to see them in everyday life type things, and it's really important because I think when we hear the word false teachers and all that, we think the word heresy. And Scott McKnight actually kind of brings this up in that when Jesus was saying this, he says, while heresy may be involved, the fundamental orientation in this text is that these false teachers, these false prophets, they were living disobediently.
Right. So again, we wouldn't necessarily see that unless you get to know a person.
That's right.
So you really have to get close enough to see them live their life. So you're seeing them beyond being in the church building and on a stage.
Yeah. Yeah, you're seeing them in the real world. You're seeing them with their spouse, kids, staff, servers, just whoever they interact with.
Mm-hmm. Now, the other thing is time, in that if that person's trying really hard to put on a good front, you may not notice right away that they're not a godly person because they look godly, even up close.
Well, especially if, you know, we've all probably been guilty of it.
Yep.
We learn the right words to say.
Yep.
You know, and some of those words and ways and all that can, again, be somewhat impressive and make us look a certain way beyond what we are. And it does take time to be like, oh, wait a minute.
Yeah. So I think just like an actual tree that we might be able to view over several seasons, does it continue to produce fruit? Does it wither away after a season or two? Does the fruit become much less or diseased or deformed? And I think it's exactly the same with leaders. We need to see them, as we've said, outside of the church building, off the stage, to determine their character? Things that might give us an indication of that is, how do they treat their spouse or their kids or their staff or the servers at a restaurant?
Mm-hmm.
Do they say one thing when they're on stage and or in public and behave differently in private? Jesus had a word for that. He called the Pharisees this of his day. He called them hypocrites, and the Pharisees were the church leaders of his day.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to really notice this. Vijay Gupta writes this. The Pharisees believed that they had arrived at a destination of pleasing God in their righteousness.
Right.
So there was that miss. And I think it's really important as we're not talking about looking at leaders and teachers and prophets with the idea of they do nothing wrong.
Yeah.
It's the idea of this. They believe they arrived at the destination of pleasing God in their righteousness, as opposed to the sinners who followed Jesus when they were along the road ahead. The kingdom door was open to them, and hope shined forth.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's just a way to see that we are looking at the Pharisees and the idea of the hypocrites based on the idea of we look what we've got here. We've arrived, whatever that looks like, and therefore it almost gives excuse.
Yeah,
because they've essentially prioritized certain things here, and they may acknowledge this is somewhat important, but they've put it back here.
Yeah,
and a lot of times that's what Jesus was worried about. He's like, no, you're doing this, but this is part of the law too.
Yeah,
this is part of God, what God said too, and it's bringing things
or
into
even
there.
the motivation behind the law.
Yeah,
they were very good at keeping the rules, and Jesus said, you talked about tithing and how they tithe the 10th even on their gardens' produce, but they lacked empathy and compassion and generosity.
Right, and then there's that again, a priority thing of just like, well, we do this.
Yeah,
this really good, and you're like, well, yeah, that is good, but why does this get?
Because this is really easy to measure.
That's right,
and this is a lifestyle.
Yeah. This might take a lot of work.
This might take a lot of work. Yeah.
Well, I think it's just, we also need to know that we are in a culture where it's really easy to do that. We've been talking about, maybe in the local church, but because of the internet, because everything seems so close, we often grant spiritual authority to people we never actually encounter and probably never will encounter. And so we may not have the idea of time, and that doesn't mean stop listening to them, but I think it's the idea of that is just to make sure that, hey, they might be great communicator. They might be a great author. They might, all that sort of stuff, and we're going to get lost out of them. That's good. That's great. But kind of keep that idea of like, but let's not put them on a pedestal because we don't have that proximity. We'll never have that
and I think this comes back to the conversation we had last video, is that it isn't by transfer of information alone. So when we get something off of social media or YouTube or even at a large church where we're mostly watching somebody on a screen, we may get really good information.
Yeah, and value that.
But we're never really going to get to know the person, and that always neglects the relational side of a relationship where actual transformation can take place.
That's right. Yeah. Well, I think probably one more thing just to put in there is the idea of proximity and stuff like that in time is to make sure there can be good reasons. I don't want to knock that, but sometimes we just may never attend a church long enough.
Yeah. To
really be able to give it time to really see that.
And I think that's part of our culture too. We've become so consumeristic in our choices, even of churches, that when a church no longer pleases us or our family changes and our kids grow up a little bit and we had a great children's ministry here, but the youth isn't so great, so we're going to go to a different church where they have a better youth program or things like that. And we're not making the investment long term in a church to really determine if the character is there, because we ourselves are not giving the church or the leadership a chance to really get to know them and their character. And we're sort of negating the ability to even develop a relationship or relationships within the church community because we're never really making an investment long term to and like you say, that's
Sometimes there's good reasons.
It doesn't mean there's not good reasons
Absolutely.
to change churches, but I think there's an opposite to that as well.
Yeah, exactly. Well, once again, thank you for joining us as we just finished this video 13 of this series, Seriously. We hope that you're getting things from this. Again, we'll take some time to have a conversation with missional community, with friends, have some coffee.
Yep.
There's some questions that will be attached to the show notes that just can take you a little bit further if you need that help in more conversation. Thank you for joining us. Please like and subscribe, and we'll talk to you in the next video.